Now, naturally, this has led to talk of Flair signing with AEW. I have no desire to see Ric Flair on television every week. I know he is good friends with Tony Khan, and Flair invited him to his wedding before AEW even existed. They had a friendship there. So they know each other. I'm sure Tony Khan would love to sign the Nature Boy. They already use other legends in a managerial role like Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard and Jake Roberts. I don't care to see it. I think one time for the visual of a Horseman reunion on camera with Arn and Tully, and maybe they bring J.J. Dillon back again. Okay, that would be cool. One time. I think bringing Flair in the way they did with Bret Hart for a one-shot would be fine. But as a regular performer, I have no desire to see that. And there's one more thing to keep in mind that you have to understand here, that a lot of people aren't really talking about. Dark Side of the Ring is doing an episode on the plane ride from hell later this year. That episode is very likely to paint Ric Flair in a very poor light. It is not going to be very kind to the Nature Boy. Even though it's something that happened almost 20 years ago, and we pretty much all know the story by now. But I know they got at least one of the flight attendants to talk and to open up on the show about what happened. It's not going to be pretty for a lot of people, but Ric Flair especially. It is not going to be pretty if they tell the full story. It is going to dredge up a lot of bad stuff. And if I'm Tony Khan, frankly, I'm not sure that I want to be associated with Ric Flair right now before that episode drops. The audio that you heard there at the top was from Sound Off 716, exactly 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. I told you this was going to happen. Dark Side of the Ring returned this week with the Plane Ride from Hell episode, which was the lowest rated episode of the series to date, but it was the one that caused the most controversy coming out of it. And Vice has put the entire episode on its YouTube channel with over 400,000 views so far and counting. So in the end, it'll be watched by a lot more. In case you do not have Vice, if you have not already seen the episode, you can simply go on YouTube and watch it there. If you want a frame of reference for what we're going to be talking about here. When I was done watching this episode, I was reminded of the Harvey Dent quote from one of my all-time favorite movies, The Dark Knight, when he said, "You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain." And that is especially true coming out of this episode. Nobody came out of this episode looking better than they did coming into it. Now, most of us knew the stories. I've talked about it on the podcast before, right? These stories have been told ad nauseum over the years of wrestlers getting boozed up and pilled up on the flight. Brock Lesnar fighting with Kurt Hennig, Sean Waltman cutting off Michael Hayes' ponytail, a drunken Goldust serenading his ex-wife over the loudspeaker, and Ric Flair wearing nothing but his robe, harassing the flight attendants. But this time, we got to hear a first-person account from one of those flight attendants, this lady, Heidi Doyle. And to see and to hear her tell her story in her own words, it just hits differently than just reading something on the internet or hearing somebody joke about it in a radio interview or a podcast interview. This added a new dimension to a story that has been told over and over again for a number of years, with additional details that perhaps some people had never heard before. Now, people talk about the plane ride from hell, right, as if it's an isolated incident. It's not. These things were commonplace back in the day, as evidenced by all of the people who couldn't even get their story straight on whether or not Vince McMahon and Linda McMahon were even on the flight. The documentary said that they were, which never made any sense to me, because if things had gotten out of hand to that degree, I don't think that there's any chance that happens with the boss and his wife on that plane. Now, since then, there have been people on the plane who swear that, in fact, Vince and Linda were not on the flight, and they were getting confused with a different one. And the producers got it wrong, which it looks like they may have. But then again, you have the other famous story of Vince McMahon wrestling Kurt Angle in the aisle of the plane and waking up Undertaker, who he's all groggy, and he wakes up and he looks over and he sees Kurt Angle. He sees this person on top of Vince McMahon thinking he's killing the boss. So he puts Kurt in a chokehold and almost chokes him unconscious. Kurt himself has referred to this as the plane ride from hell. That did not happen on the plane ride from hell. When this plane was in the air on its way back from the Insurrection pay-per-view in London, Kurt Angle was teaming with Chris Jericho against Hulk Hogan and The Rock at a house show in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So unless Kurt Angle has mastered the science of cloning, and I think, as far as wrestling matches go, this business would be a lot better off if we had a whole fucking army of Kurt Angle clones. Unless he's done that, he was not on the plane ride from hell. Insurrection, I think, was a Raw crew show. This is when they were divided, Raw crew, SmackDown crew. The SmackDown crew was back in the States, except for I think, just Triple H, who did work the pay-per-view, because I think at that time he was advertised for the show already, and he was the champion, but then he lost the title. They made that last-second decision to put the title on Hogan at the most recent, was it Backlash, I guess it would have been. There was a pay-per-view a few weeks before this, and they kept Triple H on the tour anyway, because I guess they felt they needed him. But anyway, to my point, that was a different plane ride from hell. There have been lots of such plane rides. It is easy to get confused with stories of wrestlers H-bombing women and fondling them when they pass out, and cutting their clothes off or pulling their tops off, having their way with them, and then laughing about it after. And telling these stories years later in shoot interviews like a badge of honor. They're not even trying to hide it. They openly tell these stories. That was the wrestling business. That includes a lot of your favorites. And probably a lot of mine, too. Some stories we know about. Think about all the ones that we don't. So, to the people who say, it's been 20 years, it's old news, who cares? Sometimes these things just need a little push into the mainstream, whether it's an article, whether it's a documentary in this case, and all of a sudden, what's old is new again. And it shines a whole new light on it. Look at what happened with the Allentown Morning Call story on the 30th anniversary of Nancy Argentino's death. She died in 1983. Jimmy Snuka skated on that for decades, until the paper did a story about it, and it led to charges being filed against him 30 years after the fact. There was no social media back then. There was no 24-hour cable news cycle like there was back then. If there was, he might still be sitting in a prison cell right now. The only reason that the charges were even dropped against him is because they deemed that he wasn't, in a state to be tried. By that point, he was old, he was sick, he died right after that. Had things been put in motion all those years ago, he probably would have been sitting in a cage for all these years. And so that's what happened here. The story was given new life. It was given the documentary treatment, and it turned into a big news story this week, and the fallout from it may not be over yet. The flight came the day before the WWF changed from the World Wrestling Federation to World Wrestling Entertainment. It was the very next day they dropped the F. They had just wrapped up a UK exclusive pay-per-view show. They were about to head home, but there were weather issues back home, so they were delayed. And they sat on the tarmac on that plane for 7 hours. And we got to hear from Heidi, one of the flight attendants who was willing to come forward publicly with her story. She worked for SportJet, which routinely flew teams to, out of the Phoenix area all over the place, but, teams like the Mariners and the Suns. The Mariners are in Seattle, but, that's what they did on a routine basis. And when you have a charter flight like this, you don't have to deal with the general public. You don't have to deal with the bums like you and me. They have their own private jet. And while they sat there for all of those 7 hours, they went through not one, not two, but 3 liquor carts. That's before they even left the ground. So these guys were already hammered, not to mention whatever else they were doing. When the flight was finally over, there were syringes laying around everywhere. Mike Chioda was interviewed for that. I mean, a lot of different people were interviewed for this, but Mike Chioda was interviewed for this. He didn't come off well either. Just laughing at everything. He talked about the boys sometimes giving people halcyon bombs, where they drop it in their drink behind their back to knock them out. I've talked about the halcyon stuff before. The Bulldogs were said to be notorious for it back in the day, as were the Rockers. They would do it. The Rockers would do it as a rib. Jannetty, he still gleefully talks about all those stories and all the women that they H-bombed. Brutus Beefcake, he said that the Rockers, they would drug him. They would have their way with him. And then Sean and Marty would throw him out of the hotel room naked into the hallway. Apparently this was commonplace. Rob Van Dam, I thought, out of everybody who was interviewed on this special, Rob Van Dam came across as the most sane, level-headed individual out of the whole bunch. I wouldn't say he comes across well either. There was an acceptance back then when it came to this kind of stuff. Even taking the sexual stuff, the sexual assault stuff, out of it, just for a second. There is nothing funny or cool about drugging somebody behind their back. Or, roofing them, spiking their drink when they're not looking. Jim Ross in the episode flat out said, back then, you never leave your drink. Never leave your drink uncovered. Because if you did, there was a pretty good chance it was going to be spiked. They covered Kurt Hennig, who loved to rib people, putting shaving cream on Brock Lesnar's head while he slept, and then smacking him on the head. These two were friends, 2 Minnesota boys. But Kurt would always fuck with people, and Brock was not the person to fuck with, even back then. Brock didn't like that very much. The next thing you know, Lesnar is throwing this guy around the plane. They broke some seats. They slammed up against the emergency exit door. Now, they do make it clear in the episode that the door was not going to open. At 30,000 feet in the air, that door wasn't opening. It was physically impossible. But they could have broken the fuselage, which is the body of the plane, and if they had to make an emergency landing, as the flight attendant said, where are you going to land? You're over the Atlantic Ocean. Where are you supposed to land? So I'm sure that it was terrifying. Even if I knew, okay, that door is not going to open. If I saw Brock Lesnar enraged, tackling somebody into the emergency exit door, I'm going to panic too. Terry Runnels told a story about Lesnar exposing himself to her the previous night in the locker room, and she just no-sold it. Dustin was there when it happened. They were divorced by that point, but he was there. He saw it happen. And his reaction was to just follow her out the door, go over to her and say, hey, don't sell it. Just don't sell it. That's what a lot of the women were told over the years. Just don't sell it. Don't sell it. Pretend like it doesn't bother you. Don't sell it. And the producers put a little note in the episode that they tried to reach out to Lesnar for comment. They were unable to do so, which, of course they were. I mean, they'd probably have to trek into the mountains of Saskatchewan to get a comment from him. And if they tried doing that, they probably wouldn't come back alive. But there's no excuses. There's no excuses. It's disgusting what he did. And he's talked about how drugged up he was back then during that period when he first broke into the wrestling business. He was very young. I think that was only a month after he debuted on TV. But that's not an excuse. There's another story Jim Cornette has told over the years about Brock in his OVW days. Grabbing Jim's wife. I don't know if they were married at the time, but Jim is married to a former wrestler who was working for OVW at the time, this woman who, I think she went by the name of Sin. And, he's told the story about the time that Lesnar grabbed his wife hard by the crotch on a gorilla press spot in the ring. Like, hard down there. And telling her in advance that he was going to do it, even though she had warned him, be careful down there, because she had just gotten her nether regions pierced, and I guess it was still sore. And he's like, I'm going to squeeze it. I'm going to squeeze it. And she's like, you better not. And sure enough, he supposedly clamped down as hard as he could, and she came back to the locker room and she was crying, and it led to a whole confrontation with Lesnar and Cornette. Just, you know, big, dumb jock, bully type shit that he was known for back then. And you hope that that's all it was him being young and stupid. But that's still no excuse to treat people like that. But when you're a big name, or in this case, he was a big up-and-coming name at that time. He wasn't even an established name at the time, but obviously they saw money in him. When you're a big name like that, you're going to be given a lot more leeway than somebody who is more expendable. That's just how it is. And that's not just a wrestling thing. That's a sports thing. That's an entertainment thing. Actors, musicians, you name it. If you are a big name and a big celebrity and you make people a lot of money, you're going to get a lot more chances to fuck up than the average person is going to. The wrestling business is no different. Shouldn't be that way. It's wildly fucked up. But that's how it's always been. Michael Hayes. He was on the flight. He randomly took a shot at JBL. Why the fuck would you do that? Apparently at that point JBL was passed out. He was sleeping in his seat. Of all the people, JBL is actually quiet, and you're going to wake him up? So he punches him. He's trying to open up. I guess Bradshaw got a cut on his head when he bladed in a match the night before. So he opened him up, and Bradshaw's bleeding all over himself, and that leads to Bradshaw getting up, and he knocks out Michael Hayes, which then led to Sean Waltman later on cutting off Michael Hayes' ponytail after he got H-bombed. And he was passed out on the plane. He was totally out. And Waltman chopped off his ponytail. And he was not happy about it. When he woke up and found out what happened, he wanted to know who did it. Who did it? Next day at TV, X-Pac nailed the ponytail. It was either to a door or a wall in the locker room. JR saw it. He pulled it down. He threw it away. How Michael Hayes has survived in that company as long as he has is a mystery to me. He is a man-child who never grew up. Then again, I guess the person who runs the company is a man-child who never grew up. Now it all makes sense. Now that I say this out loud, it makes all the sense of the world. But that's what Hayes comes off as every one of these stories that I hear. And this is him as an agent and a producer, not even a wrestler. He's in a position of authority in this company. And he's acting like a man-child. He dresses up like one of the fucking lollipop kids from The Wizard of Oz. The guy made a drunken ass out of himself at Stephanie McMahon's wedding to the point where Linda McMahon had to snatch the microphone out of his hand and kick him off stage. People have been fired for far less than what Michael Hayes has done over the years. He's been suspended for using a racial slur. He's been demoted. But I guess his contributions are apparently so great, he's worth keeping employed. He's worth all the bad publicity over the years. Dustin. He grabbed the microphone. He started singing David Allan Coe's Pledging My Love to the PA over the PA system to his ex-wife, who was mortified. The flight attendant was trying to get her microphone away from him. He wouldn't give it back. Finally, Jim Ross comes out. I don't know where he was. He was up in first class, I guess. Wherever the fuck he was. He comes out. He has to go over to Dustin and say, sit your ass down. And then came the Ric Flair stuff. And Tommy Dreamer, who, in his defense of the Nature Boy, forever stained his name. Even though there were no stories of Dreamer being involved in anything bad here that we know of, he didn't have to say a thing. He didn't have to say a word. He chose to participate in this episode, which I'm sure is going to chase a lot of other people in the future away from participating in these episodes. He chose to participate and open his mouth and say the things that came out of his mouth, and now he is rightfully being raked over the coals for it because what he said and the way in which he said it was fucking repulsive. And I'll get to that in a second. First, he explained that Flair, as a joke, would sometimes wear only his robe with nothing on underneath, and he would swing his dick around like a helicopter. Which is not a visual that I needed. And he complimented the size of what he called his hammer. Flair would have been 53 years old at the time of this flight, and he was still pulling this shit. Heidi says that she was in the kitchen area of the plane, which is a very narrow area. If you've ever been on an airplane, you know how narrow it can be back there by the bathroom and everything. And she was back there, and here comes Flair, wearing only his robe, and she says he wouldn't leave. And she alleges that he was spinning his dick around and he wanted her to touch it. And then she claims that he grabbed her hand and placed it on him. She says Goldust was the only one, after minutes of this, went on for minutes. He was the only one to eventually come over and stop Flair. When the drunken American Idol wannabe is the only one to come over and save the day, there's a very big problem here. Now, Flair, for his part, he has denied over the years the allegations. And in fact, he was just on Renee Paquette's podcast, her Oral Sessions podcast. What a fucking name for a podcast for him to be on. And she brought up the fact that, hey, you know, Dark Side of the Ring is going to be covering the plane ride from hell in a few weeks. And this was Flair's response to Renee. This was just last week. He said, God, I've heard about it too, just when things are going good for me. Listen, you put me on your podcast after. We'll see how it plays out, because I was there and I don't care whose name I gotta drop if the heat falls on me. I know who was where and who and what took place. I know the whole story. Ball's in your court, Nate. He claims he knows the whole story. Well, let's hear it. Let's hear it. Because it's not looking too good. CarShield announced they have suspended their ad campaign with Flair. They've put a pause on it. And they are going to do their due diligence. CarShield is full of shit. It's not as if they didn't know what they were getting into when they got in bed with this guy. The robe stuff, stories like that, those have been around for years, dating back to the 80s when he was still the NWA champion. What do you think? He went naked in his robe only on WWE flights when he was 50 years old? That was happening for years. WWE did a Storytime episode on the network that was floating around again, on clips of which were floating around on social media this week. You know, they have that cartoon show, Storytime. They do the illustrated stories of ribs and all kinds of wrestler stories from over the years. It might have been the first episode that they ever did, I think from the first season. I could be wrong about that. But anyway, they did a whole story on it as part of one of those Storytime shows that was not about the plane ride from hell. Some people think, oh, it was about the plane ride from hell. I can't believe they would do that. It was not about the plane ride from hell. This is what I mean about all this confusion that I've seen on social media this week. This is not the only time that Flair has done this. That episode was not specifically about the plane ride from hell. It was about Flair wearing his robe and getting naked in front of airline stewardesses and people in the past. It was not specifically about this flight. However, Peacock pulled the episode anyway. You cannot find it on there anymore. And I suspect that episode will not be going back up, or if it does, they're going to cut out the Flair portion. But these are the exact comments that Tommy Dreamer, to go back to him, these are the exact comments that Tommy Dreamer made that got him into a lot of hot water this week. And I want to read them to you. I transcribed this myself. This is what he said. Ric Flair's not going to try to impose by force any sexual stuff onto anybody. He's just flaunting, styling and profiling, doing like the Ric Flair stuff where everybody's going to laugh about it. And then he rolls his eyes and he says, but obviously someone took offense to it. If that's how she felt, maybe she should have not taken a payout and went to the fullest extent of the law to then truly put this heinous person in jail. And the look on his face as he is saying this, my words do not do it justice. His face says more than the words that were actually coming out of his mouth. And then he said, I feel this is trying to portray someone as a sexual predator. And it's not. It's a joke. It's a gag. And today, 1000% inappropriate. My hairstyle is inappropriate right now. I am somehow offending someone with my double ponytail. Why do I have two ponytails? And my answer is I'm 50 years old and I'm happy I have hair. But if you're asking me, he goes, I've hung out with Ric Flair. I've never seen him try to force his will against anybody. So those were the comments of one Tommy Dreamer, who, out of all the bozos on this plane who were doing stupid shit, is the one who comes out of this looking the worst and paying the heaviest price. Because, as I said, the stories about Flair behaving like a jackass have been around for years. Tommy Dreamer is somebody who actually had, and probably still with a lot of people has, a lot of respect. He is a well-respected veteran in the wrestling business. A lot of people like Tommy Dreamer, have worked with Tommy Dreamer, have a lot of positive things to say about Tommy Dreamer. That's what makes it so bad. Because a lot of those people watch this and their jaws dropped. I watched this and, when I heard these comments and I saw him on camera and he made the comments that he made, my jaw was open. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I couldn't believe that as he was saying these words in his head, he thought it was a good idea to actually be saying the things that he was saying. I was gobsmacked. And that's what makes this so much worse. That's why he's coming out of this looking the worst. Nobody is shocked by the Flair stuff. They're shocked by what Tommy Dreamer had to say. And if Tommy Dreamer was on camera having said these comments in the mid-2000s, let's say not long after this happened, it feels like a lifetime ago in the wrestling business. I mean, it still would have been bad, but it would not have had the same effect. It's the fact that these are fresh, new comments in the modern day, 2021, and he's being interviewed about this, and this is what he says. Tommy Dreamer has 2 daughters, twin girls. I wonder how he would feel if he found out that Ric Flair, not knowing who their father is, approached one of them in nothing but his robe and put their hand on his cock. If he would have a conversation with them after the fact and explain that, well, that's just Rick being Rick. He's the nature boy. He didn't mean anything by it. Now, he could always claim that he didn't know the details, but he knew enough to acknowledge that there was a payout. He knew about that. And there was a lawsuit by both flight attendants a couple of years later, and a settlement that came out of it. So he can't plead ignorance to that. Someone should tell Tommy Dreamer that the reason this one flight attendant didn't pursue charges when perhaps she would have is because her husband pushed for a settlement to spare their kids the embarrassment of a public trial. And the airline that she worked for allegedly pushed her to keep quiet because they handled flights for other sports teams, as I mentioned before, and it would be bad publicity, it would be bad for business if this turned into a whole spectacle. His comments were appalling. There is no defense of what Tommy Dreamer said on this episode. And evidently, Impact Wrestling agreed, because the next day, Ed Nordholm sent a company-wide email announcing that Dreamer was suspended indefinitely going forward. Dreamer has worked behind the scenes there for some time. He's worked in a creative capacity for Impact. Sometimes he wrestles for them. Nordholm said that Dreamer's comments were out of line with our core values as a company, and that he was asked to leave immediately, effective immediately, from Nashville, and was suspended going forward. He's lucky he wasn't fired straight away. He put Impact in an impossible position. They did what they had to do. And it looks like he may have lost his hosting gig on Busted Open Radio as well. On the show the day after, Dave LaGreca said that they are taking this very seriously and they do not condone the behavior displayed on the show. We'll see how that shakes out. Only about an hour ago, Dreamer issued this statement. He has issued a statement So regarding my comments made on Dark Side of the Ring, it was never my intention to offend, hurt, or victim shame anyone. I understand my comments were insensitive and could trigger emotions in someone's own personal past. I do not condone sexual misconduct of any kind. I apologize to anyone I offended. From the bottom of my heart, I am so sorry. Those are the words of Tommy Dreamer, who, honestly, there really was no other way for him to respond to this. To respond in any kind of defiant way or double down on those comments would have been career suicide for him. So these are the right comments to make. I hope he believes them. I hope he understands why people are so upset and understands why he came across so poorly in this episode. Scott Hall was another one on the plane. He claimed that Hennig H-bombed him, and he has no memory of anything else from the flight, but Heidi, the flight attendant, says that he was sitting in his seat. She had gone over to him. I think it might have been, she was maybe asking if he wanted something. I don't remember exactly what she was asking him, but he was sitting in his seat, and he looked up and he told her, he goes, "I'm going to lick you." And he tried to lick her. He may have licked her, but he certainly at least tried to, and then he passed out. He was so fucked up and so out of it that he passed out. After that, she had enough. She stayed in the kitchen area. She didn't get back up until that plane touched the ground. Hall was so out of it. People on the plane, when they landed and they saw him, they thought that he was dead. Justin Credible had to wheel him through the airport like a corpse. So Hennig was fired for his part in all of this. Hall was fired, which was inevitable from the moment he came back. All you had to do was start a countdown and take bets on which month he would be gone. JR said that he fined Dustin because he felt firing him would be too extreme. And when the producer asked him, how come Ric Flair evaded any kind of punishment for this? JR went silent for a few seconds. Because, he's friends with Rick. So he's thinking, how can I answer this diplomatically? Well, you know what? There is no diplomatic answer. He just told the truth, which is, good question, because he's a made man. He got a pass. And there it is. Flair is Teflon. For whatever reason, he gets a pass. Because, like with, the Hogan tape, unless there was something that he did or that he said over all these years that was so horrible that it was caught on tape or on film and it leaked so people could hear it and see it with their own eyes, absent something like that, people just don't want to believe it. They hear the stories, but they just don't want to believe that this person could be capable of anything that is even remotely sinister. They don't want to believe that somebody they grew up idolizing could turn out to be such a flawed human being. Big stars and celebrities and athletes, they almost always get a pass. I'm not saying it's right. That's just the reality of how it is. Pro wrestling is no different. I can understand why Jim Ross is sick of talking about the plane ride from hell. He's ashamed of what happened on that plane. A bunch of grown men, a lot of them with children at home, acting like grade school kids. It's fucking pathetic. As I am recording this, WWE is kicking off a European tour. They're going to be in London tomorrow at the O2 Arena. And we know there won't be any alcohol served on those flights. Well, I mean, there might be if they're flying commercial, but I don't know if they even do charter flights for them anymore. But if they did, they wouldn't be served any liquor because they did away with that because of this flight. There won't be any stories like that coming out of this tour, I can promise you that. But the next episode coming up is on Chris Kanyon this Thursday, and that one is not likely to be very kind to Ric Flair either. If Tony Khan was thinking about bringing Ric Flair in, and I'm sure he was, now would be a good time to put those plans on hold indefinitely. Because this is not the kind of publicity that AEW needs when they're trying to build goodwill with their audience. Or any major company for that matter. It doesn't even have to be AEW. Any major company for that matter.